road stretched endlessly under the pale moonlight. The trees on both sides stood still like frozen sentinels. The air was heavy, thick with silence. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed, only the headlights of Mark's car cut through the darkness. Mark glanced at the clock on his dashboard. The numbers flickered, then glitched, showing symbols. Instead of time, his stomach tightened. He shook his head. Must be tired, must be imagining things. The road kept going, but the turn he was waiting for never came. His phone buzzed, but when he looked at the screen, there was no name, no number, just a blank notification. He swiped it away, but the buzzing continued, a soft hum. Inside his bones, a whisper under his skin. A figure stood by the side of the road. A woman barefoot wearing a thin white dress, her long black hair covered her face. Mark slowed down, hesitated, then against every instinct rolled his window down just a little. "Do you need help?" The woman lifted her head, her face was pale. Her lips cracked, her eyes too wide, too dark. Mark's heart pounded. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Just a sound like the wind screaming through an empty house. Mark slammed his foot on the gas. The car roared forward. His breath came in short gasps when he glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone, the road behind him empty, silent, endless. His phone buzzed again. The screen showed a message from an unknown number. "Don't look back." His hands shook. He dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. His pulse thundered in his ears. A shadow passed across the headlights. Something moved across the road too. Fast, too tall, too wrong. The car swerved. Mark gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. The tires screeched against the pavement. The car stopped, the engine dead. The headlights flickered. The radio crackled. A voice whispering low and urgent. Mark reached for the key, tried to turn it. But his fingers were numb. The air around him grew colder. The woman was standing in front of the car, her head tilted. Her mouth stretched too wide into a grin. Her arms hung limp at her sides, her feet hovering just above the ground. Mark couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She raised one hand slowly, her fingers twitching as if pulling invisible strings. Mark's body locked in place, his vision blurred. His chest tightened. His breath came in ragged gasps. The car doors unlocked by themselves. One by one, the locks clicked open. Mark's shaking hands slammed down on the buttons, trying to relock them, but they wouldn't. It budged, the woman's feet touched the ground, and she took a step forward. The radio screeched, static filled the car. Then a voice, low, distorted. "Mark, Mark, Mark." The sound wrapped around his brain, dug into his skull. His own name didn't feel like his own anymore. He shut his eyes tightly, whispered a prayer he had long forgotten. "Please, please, please." The air shifted. The pressure lifted. Silence rang in his ears. He dared to open his eyes. She was gone. The road was empty. His breath shuddered out of him. The car engine roared back to life. The headlights bright again, the radio silent. Mark didn't hesitate. He floored the gas. The car sped forward into the night. The turn appeared ahead, the road he had been waiting for. He took it without thinking, desperate to leave whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. The trees pressed, closed the darkness thicker, the road narrower. Mark's breath came in short, sharp bursts. The car began to slow against his will. His foot pressed the gas, but the car ignored him. The figures stepped closer, their movements unnatural, twitching, broken like puppets on invisible strings. Darkness swallowed the headlights, the road, the car. Mark's screams echoed into the void. The road was empty. The car was gone. The night stretched on, waiting, waiting, waiting. The silence after Mark's scream was deafening. The road was gone. The car was gone. There was nothing but an endless void stretching in all directions. He stood alone, the air around him, thick, suffocating, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. A whisper slid through the darkness. "Mark, Mark, come back home." The voice was soft, familiar, his mother's voice, but she had been dead for years. His breath hitched. His body refused to move. Something brushed against his shoulder, light as a feather but cold as ice. He turned slowly, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The woman stood inches from him, her mouth too wide, her skin cracked and peeling behind. Her more figures emerged from the dark, all of them, whispering his name, all of them stepping closer. Mark stumbled back, his foot met nothing, he was falling. The darkness swallowed him. Whole, his stomach lurched, his arms flailed, but there was nothing to hold on to. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, merging into one endless sound. He hit the ground hard, but there was no pain. The floor beneath him was smooth, cold, endless. A light flickered in the distance, pale blue, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. He had no choice. He walked toward it. The air changed. It felt heavier wet. The smell of damp earth filled his lungs. Shadows twisted along the ground, moving like living things. The light ahead grew brighter, revealing a door. An old wooden door covered in deep claw marks. His fingers trembled as he reached for the handle. It was warm, too warm, like something alive. A deep exhale came from the other side. Slow, long waiting, he pulled the door open. Inside was his childhood bedroom. Untouched, unchanged, but wrong. The colors were muted. The bed was too small. The window showed nothing but blackness. His reflection in the mirror moved on its own, tilting its head, smiling when he wasn't. Tea! The closet door creaked open by itself. Darkness yawned wide inside. Something moved within shifting breathing. Mark stepped back, but his legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor. A hand shot out from the closet, small pale fingers gripping the frame. A child stepped out, or something that looked like a child. Its face was too smooth. Its eyes too deep. Its mouth opened, but no sound came. Mark tried to scream, but no voice came out. The child reached for him. Its fingers stretched too long. Its shadow wrapped around the walls, swallowing the room inch by inch. The light overhead flickered. The whispers returned, growing louder, deafening. The walls pulsed like living flesh. Mark clutched his head, pain splitting through his skull. His reflection in the mirror grinned wider. The child touched his arm. Cold fire spread through his veins. His body stiffened. His mouth stretched open, but it wasn't his own voice that came out. It was theirs, all of theirs. The whispers now inside him. His skin cracked. His fingers twitched against his will. The mirror showed his body changing, stretching, shifting into something else, something hollow, something waiting. The door slammed shut. The light went out. The whispers faded. The house stood silent at the end of the road, waiting. A car approached, headlights cutting through the night. Another traveler lost, another name to whisper, another voice to join the endless dark. The car slowed down, tires crunching against the gravel. The driver, a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes and a restless mind, stared at the house at the end of the road. Something about it felt wrong, but she couldn't explain why. Her phone screen flickered. The clock showed strange symbols. Her radio hummed with static. A whisper curled through the air, so soft, so distant. She almost didn't notice it. Turn back. Turn back. Turn back. She gripped the wheel tighter. A strange pressure filled her chest. She had been driving for hours, searching for a place to rest. The road had twisted in ways she didn't remember. She was sure she had been here before, but that was impossible. A shadow passed behind her car, just outside the edge of her headlights. Her breath hitched. Her fingers hovered over the lock button. Before she could press it, the doors unlocked by themselves. One by one, the clicking sound echoed inside the silent car. She turned quickly, looking into the back seat. Her pulse hammering. Nothing there. Only darkness pressing against the windows, thick, heavy. Watching the whisper return closer now, inside the car behind her ear. You shouldn't have come. She slammed her foot on the gas. The car roared forward, but the road stretched longer. Then, before the house at the end of the road didn't disappear, it stayed in her rear view mirror. No matter how fast she drove, no matter how many turns she took, her breath came in short, ragged bursts. The trees lining the road seemed closer, their twisted branches reaching toward. Her headlights pulsed. The static on the radio shifted. Low voices rising, overlapping. She could almost make out words, almost. Then she saw it, standing in the middle of the road just ahead. A man, his back turned, his body still, too still. Her hands jerked the wheel. The car swerved, skidding to a stop just inches from him, but he didn't react. He just stood there, head slightly tilted. Her shaking hands reached for the horn, but before she could press it, he turned slowly, too slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth curved into a too wide grin. She knew that face. She had seen it before in the missing posters and the news articles, in her nightmares. Mark, the man who vanished, the man who was never found. But he wasn't a man anymore. His skin cracked, his fingers twitched, his shadow stretched too long against the road. Her own shadow twitched in response, as if trying to pull away from her body. Her body locked in place. Her hands wouldn't move. Her legs wouldn't obey. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. Mark stepped forward, his movements jerky, wrong, his grin never fading. He reached for her fingers, too long, nails too sharp. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Static filled her ears. Her vision blurred. The world tilted. Then the whispers returned, louder this time. Inside her skull, repeating the same three words over and over. Stay with us. The darkness pressed closer. The headlights flickered. The car doors unlocked again. Mark was closer, his breath cold against her cheek, his hands just inches from her throat. Her own hands lifted against, her will reaching toward him, fingers twitching. Then silence thick, complete, suffocating the headlights. Went out, the radio died the night. Swallowed the car whole, the road was empty, the car was gone. The house at the end of the road waited. The road stretched silent, endless, forgotten. The trees stood still, like statues, their twisted limbs reaching for something no longer. There the wind whispered through the empty space where a car once stood, where a driver once gasped, where a man once smiled. The house at the end of the road watched, its windows dark, empty, waiting. The door stood slightly open, a quiet invitation, a promise or a trap. Inside, the whispers never stopped, never slowed, never faded. The missing posters in town grew by one another, name, another face, another lost soul. The road remained empty, waiting,